Welcome to Real News. I'm Mark Steiner. Great to have you all with us. Turkey announced that it's ready to press charges against 20 Saudi nationals, including a former deputy head of intelligence, for their involvement in the murder of Jamal Khashoggi a year and a half ago. Turkish President Erdogan made no secret of his opposition to Saudi politics. In addition to opposing their war in Yemen, its involvement in the Libyan civil war, Erdogan also accused Saudi Arabia of not telling the truth about how widespread COVID-19 is in Saudi Arabia. He made the accusation after tests confirmed that Turkish citizens returning from the Hajj, to the city of Mecca in Saudi Arabia, obviously, were infected with COVID-19, despite claims by Saudi officials that the virus is under control. So within all that, we have to take into account also the crisis of refugees and the war raging between Turkey and Syria, and the millions of refugees, as I said earlier, that are stuck in the middle. I mean, some of them literally stuck in the middle on the borders between Turkey and Greece. So Europe has now closed its borders to all refugees fleeing, no matter where they're from, but especially the overcrowded camps in Turkey, and despair is looming all around COVID and their status being stuck. So let's hear from two refugees from Aleppo, currently in refugee camps in Syria, Ali Halak and Maha Hassan.
As you have seen the situation in the camps, we are afraid of corona. These tents are not able to protect us from the virus, and we are not able to sanitize the tents.
It is a disease that came for the whole world, and I am not afraid. I actually want to be infected with corona and die, because one can then rest from all of this life.
All these stories are deeply intertwined, and once again we turn to Dr. Boris Karjak to parse them out with his analysis. And welcome, Boris. Good to have you back with us.
Great to see you again, Mark.
Always good to see you. Boris Karjak is a lecturer in international development studies at Trent University in Ontario, Canada. He's also the editor of a book, Accumulations, Crisis and Struggles, Capital and Labor in Contemporary Capitalism. So, Boris, this is all really confusing, but let me just start with this indictment. So yes. They indicted 20 Saudis because of the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. The murder was a year and a half ago. So talk a bit about the complexities here. I mean, what's the significance that it took a year and a half to make this indictment? It comes on the heels of all the COVID crisis going on between Saudi Arabia and Turkey. Did they have a reason to delay it while everything's focused on coronaviruses? I mean, what's happening at the moment? What's the politics, and what do you think the reasoning is?
Again, it's a very complicated issue. As you said, the assassination took place about 1.5 years ago in October 2018. And right after the assassination, which took place at the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, when Khashoggi entered the premises to get papers, official papers from the Saudi officials so that he could marry his Turkish fiancée. But then he was kept there, and according to the audio recordings and many leaks from security and police officials in Turkey and elsewhere, his body was dismembered. He basically disappeared. But we are almost certain that this was done by a team that was sent by the Saudi regime to basically eliminate Khashoggi, who has been a very loud, vocal critic of the Saudi regime for some time. When we look at his earlier life, actually, he's been very close to the Saudi family and the regime. But then in the last 10 years, especially in the aftermath of the so-called Arab Spring, he's become a very vocal critic. And also the crown prince, who basically became the ruler of Saudi Arabia in 2017, he was feeling the discomfort of Khashoggi's actions, both in Europe and also in the United States, where he sought in a way refuge. So, but the issue is that it has taken 1.5 years for this indictment to come, and this should be, I think, and analyzed within the context of this tug of war that has been going on between Saudi Arabia and Turkey for almost 10 years. So this is geopolitics at work. Saudi Arabia and Turkey have found themselves on opposite sides, from Libya to Syria to Qatar, in the past 7 or 8 years. But at the same time, Turkey's President Erdogan has been treading a very fine line, and he's been very careful when it comes to not confronting the Saudi family, the royal family, and the regime directly. In this case, his target was mostly bin Salman, but not the entire regime. So he's been against vocal, but because of particularly the economic relations between the two countries, he's been very, very careful.
Why do you think it came now? Did it take a year and a half because they just got the evidence? Or is there more politics involved around many other issues in why it's just being announced now, a year and a half after it happened? It's off people's radar. COVID-19 is taking over everybody's, the news everywhere. I mean, are there connections here? Why now?
It is very difficult to give a certain answer to this question, but this may be again related to some of the challenges that Erdogan has been facing at home. That relates to what is happening in Syria's northern part, province of Idlib, what's happening in Libya, then the recent economic challenges within the country, and now the corona pandemic. So again, Erdogan is looking for enemies. He's looking to maybe to distract the public, but also get some international support in many of the adventures he's been involved in.
So do you think that anything going on with COVID-19 has to do with this? I mean, Turkey said that it's gotten this new vaccine, or this medicine, I should say, from chloroquine from China. The pandemic is rising in Turkey, one of the fast growing places in the world. 2,500 people, as my last thing I read, have been infected. At least 15 to 20 people have died from COVID-19. All these people who took part in the Hajj going to Mecca, coming back from Mecca and Saudi Arabia to Turkey, have been quarantined because they've been tested positive. And the Turkish government is accusing Saudi Arabia of not being honest about how widespread COVID is in Saudi Arabia itself. So, I mean, that also plays into this, because COVID is taking over everything. Does that play a part in all this?
Yeah, one piece of information that may be relevant is that, and you mentioned this in your introduction, that the pilgrims who went to Hajj in Saudi Arabia, some of them brought this virus with them, and they have been under quarantine. But what has characterized this process in Turkey is lack of transparency. For a long time, there was no data, there was no information coming from officials regarding the scale of the epidemic in Turkey. The officials argue that it did not exist, and then the numbers start to come in. Now the Minister of Health is being hailed as a very competent expert who's been able to address this issue and then take the necessary measures. But we still do not know the scale. And then we do not know how well the existing healthcare system in Turkey will be able to deal with this pandemic. Recent years, under the AKP years, the healthcare system has been restructured, with private healthcare becoming much more common. But we do not know how well that system will be able to address this pandemic in Turkey.
So, I mean, Turkey is facing a couple of things here. You have this indictment, and some people have argued this indictment is very political at the moment, why it came now. You have the refugee crisis. If there is a wider outbreak of COVID-19 in Turkey, it's going to affect the refugee camps, and it's going to affect the Turkish economy severely. And Turkey needs the European Union and its money to get through this. So, I mean, all these things to me are connected. These are not separate issues. They all interplay with one another in what I might call just some kind of dialectical dance. I mean, so how am I making too much of these connections? I mean, it seems to me that these things are real, given what you heard the refugees say in our opening, and the fact that this plays into it as well.
To be honest, I'm not sure. There may be a relationship, connection between all these, seemingly separate issues. But what Turkey needs now is significant help from the outside world. And there have been many calls, beginning with the fiancé of the late Khashoggi, for European countries, for the United States to take certain measures against the Saudi royal family and the regime with regard to the Khashoggi regime, assassination. So this may be an attempt on the part of the Erdogan government to receive some sympathy and maybe help from particular Western countries. And also, again, as I said, it's a distraction, but also a part of this tug of war between Saudi Arabia and Turkey that has been going on for some time, particularly in the last 3 years.
Internally, there's some battles being set up as well. I mean, the mayor of Istanbul, Ekrem İmamoğlu, did I say his name right?
İmamoğlu, yes.
Yeah. So I mean, 16 million people live in that city, and he's pushing Erdogan, saying you're not doing enough to deal with the COVID crisis or the refugee crisis or anything we're facing. So there's also an internal political dynamic that involves COVID and involves the opposition politically, trying to get the European Union in, refugees at the border. I mean, Erdogan is in a very difficult spot.
Erdogan is in a very difficult spot. There have been some measures taken by the Turkish government, but these measures are not sufficient. Also, implementation is a problem. Implementation has been a significant problem, but some of it stems from the material conditions within the country. The government has been telling people to stay home and under quarantine, but many people cannot survive. Yes, unlike Western societies, the institution of family plays a very, very important role, particularly with regard to solidarity in times of crisis in countries like Turkey. But it is not enough. Turkey has been going through a very difficult time economically. People people live from paycheck to paycheck, and they cannot survive. And I read similar news coming from India. Now, there's a lockdown in India. More than 1 billion people are being told to stay at home. But, people have been telling the government that if they stay at home, they'll die from starvation rather than the virus. And in Turkey, the Turkish society is facing a similar dilemma. On top of that, the budget is empty. Years of plundering, mismanagement, so and so, just this, corrupt regime has nothing to spend on its society. The package that was announced by the AKP recently, in a country of more than 80 million, close to 85 million, means nothing. So there are significant challenges that the Erdogan government regime is facing in Turkey, and not only domestically, but also internationally.
So, Boris, let's conclude with where we began in terms of Khashoggi and the complexities of what's happening with Khashoggi right now in Turkey, and why you think it's happening, and things that some of the major Western press maybe have missed in all of this.
Well, again, as I said, this should be studied within the context of this tug of war between Saudi Arabia and Turkey in the region. On the one hand, you see Saudi Arabia, Egypt, United Arab Emirates, etc. And on the other hand, you see this coalition that has emerged between Qatar and Turkey in recent years. And a significant part of it stems from Erdogan's initial support and also Qatar's initial support for Muslim Brotherhood in the Middle East. And the Muslim Brotherhood right now is, although it has been, or it used to be financed, supported by the Saudi regime for decades, now in Saudi Arabia, it's considered a terrorist organization. And it is seen as a significant threat to the Saudi regime. And this strained the relations between Saudi Arabia and Turkey significantly. And later, when there was there was an embargo on Qatar, Turkey decided to support this tiny country, which actually disproportionately to its size has significant influence over the region by through economic connections, but also sending Turkish troops. Now, Turkey has more than 3,000 military personnel in this tiny country in the Middle East. So I think that tug of war is significant. It's still continuing, but Erdogan, a very pragmatic politician in many ways, has also refrained from attacking the Saudi regime up front. So now he's talking about basically a few bad apples within the royal family or within the regime that committed this atrocious act at the Saudi consulate in Istanbul in 2018, rather than taking on the entire Saudi establishment. So that's important as well.
Well, Boris Karzai, thank you once again for joining us and for always kind of being able to unpack with your analysis what's really going on. I appreciate your taking time with the Real News.
It's always a pleasure. Thanks for having me, Mark.
Thank you for joining us. And I'm Mark Steiner here for the Real News Network. Thank you for joining us. Let us know what you think and take care.